right, nostalgia trappers, welcome to the program. David Parsons here. I am ready to go. I'm very excited to share this conversation. This was a sort of a mind-blowing one for me, and I hope it is for you as well. My guest today is Peter Staudenmaier. He is a professor of history at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's been writing about a number of very nostalgia trap subjects for years, particularly the idea of eco-fascism, but also larger histories of Nazi Germany, Italian fascism, and the history of environmental thought in particular, which is what I wanted to focus on with Peter today. We talk about his latest book, which came out in 2021, so very recently. Go pick it up. It's called Ecology Contested: Environmental Politics Between Left and Right. And it sort of speaks for itself, but we get into a lot of ideas here about how environmentalism and ideas about ecology fit into conspiracy theory, fit into fascism, fit into hyper-nationalism, and all sorts of really ugly shit that's circulating in the globe, around the globe right now. This was a really intense conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's another angle on a lot of the things we try to get into on this program. And I wanted to give a shout out, at the risk of sounding like a corny old grandpa, to Nostalgia Trap listeners for suggesting great guests and topics over the years. The show is better because of your suggestions. And this was a suggestion of a Nostalgia Trap listener and patron named Aiden, who wrote to me and made me aware of Peter Staudenmaier's work and his latest book, Ecology Contested, which I think, again, has added so much to what we're talking about on the show. And I just had a really good time talking with Peter Staudenmaier. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you, Aiden. Thank you to all the Nostalgia Trap listeners who have contributed ideas to the show over the years. You really make this place a lot stronger than it would be with just me. I'm just one dude. So keep the suggestions coming. If you've got ideas for guests, topics, etc., hit me up. You can find me on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Enjoy this conversation. Here is me and Peter Staudenmaier. Well, Peter Staudenmaier, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to let you know that it was a listener of this podcast that made me aware of your work, and particularly your latest book, which I wanted to say the name of before we even get started. It's called Ecology Contested: Environmental Politics Between Left and Right. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
When I hear those words, I know now that that there are environmental and ecological ideas in the far right, but I didn't know that coming of age in the 90s. And one of the things we talk about a lot on this show is like sort of Gen X, the Gen X left, and that those years. And I mean, environmentalism was something that, when I was a teenager watching MTV and like sort of coming of age, I thought environmentalism was something that was entirely a progressive on the left sort of ideas. I was watching the sort of battle in Seattle, if you remember the WTO protests.
Absolutely.
So I really thought of environmentalism and I guess anti-war movements were the ideas that drove me to the left and drove me to like anti-capitalism and feeling like. But then as I get older and I go to graduate school and I hear different ideas, and especially now watching American politics, it seems like there's another side to this. I'm wondering at what point, because it seems like you were writing about this idea of eco-fascism pretty early. At what point when do you become interested in this? Because I'll just say one more thing. I guess I should have noticed in the 90s that there was the Unabomber and there was this other sort of environmental critique going on.
That's a good example. Although for what it's worth, in the 90s, when the Unabomber first hit the headlines, there was a whole lot of enthusiasm and excitement about him on parts of the left that I was very, very much involved with myself. A lot of anarchists, a lot of North American anarchists, among others. I've been an anarchist all my adult life, so I'm strongly identified with that scene. A lot of those folks in the 90s were gung-ho about the Unabomber. I think much of that sentiment has since shifted and matured, and there's been a series of reflections and more critical takes on it. But a lot of people whose politics are rooted pretty firmly in all sorts of left movements have nonetheless, for decades now, been, in some cases, susceptible to what I argue are far-right versions of environmental thought. And you are absolutely right that it took most of us a really long time to start paying attention to that phenomenon. I would say it's only really been maybe the last 6-7 years now that a whole lot of folks, a whole lot of left, progressive, radical, whatever you want to call it, people have started to really take seriously the very idea that there could be far right versions of ecology, much less have started to pay attention to them in any detail. But it's true, I was one of the I was not the earliest by any means, but I was one of the earlier people one of the earlier voices trying to get fellow radicals to take that stuff seriously. The book that, for better or worse, the book that helped put the term ecofascism into discussion, especially in English-speaking left contexts, was a book that I co-authored that came out in 1995. My co-author was Janet Beal. It was actually her idea for the book. I was very much the junior partner in that collaborative publication. And that book came out almost at the exact same time that the Unabomber manifesto.
Wow.
So we, in a weird sense, you might say we had lucky timing or unlucky timing. I'm not sure what to call it. But for many years after that, we were two of relatively few voices that were consistently saying left ecologists or radical environmental activists have to start taking this other history seriously, because if we don't generate our own critical historical literature on this very lengthy history of right-wing forms of environmentalism, if we don't do that, then we're just conceding the entire field to the right.
And it seems especially, I don't know, I want to talk about that history because I know it goes back even further than obviously the 1990s and the 80s.
Yep.
I mean, I guess part of this is me, thinking about the 60s and the 1960s counterculture, communes. There's such an association with the left wing and environmentalism in the American political imagination. What did we miss? Because I know we can talk about other countries too. I mean, your work seems like it goes back to even Nazi Germany. And I was reading about the things that you're researching there are just incredible. The ideas of how ecology and an ecological viewpoint might fit into a right-wing ideology.
Absolutely. In some ways might fit perfectly. Unfortunately, might fit perfectly into a right wing.
Why is that? Why would that match with right wing ideology?
Sure. Well, to answer that question, I can try to give you a longer answer to the question you just posed 30 seconds ago.
Sorry, I have so much to ask you.
That's great. This is beautiful. There's a lot to talk about with this stuff.
Seriously,
the longer history of what we might call, to be as neutral as possible, what we might call the politics of nature, or the politics of the environment, or the politics of ecology, pick your favorite term. The longer term history of that political side of environmentalism is remarkably complex. And what you noted a minute ago is exactly right. If our historical horizon only extends back to the 1960s, which I have to say is true for a lot of us on the left. I was born right in the middle of the 1960s. You mentioned Generation X. I am, for better and for worse, I'm the founding member of Generation X. I was born in 1965, which is often considered the boomers ended in 1964, and those of us born in 1965 were the very first Gen Xers. So I'm the youngest.
Yeah, I'm the youngest Gen Xer, and you're the oldest Gen Xer.
I'm the oldest, precisely.
Right. Nice.
We span the
beautiful.
Exactly. We span that whole generation.
Hey, it's an important generation.
Absolutely. So if our historical horizon only goes back that far, if we only look back to the 1960s, then it kind of makes perfect sense that we would think ecology has always been a left-wing cause, that environmental or ecological politics has somehow always been affiliated with or allied with the left. If that's the time period we're looking at, if it's just the last 5 decades or so, and especially if we're selective about which societies and which cultures we're looking at during that time period, then I'll grant you, it does kind of look like ecology has always been on the left. But that is an optical illusion. And historians who study the century of environmental politics before that, extending well back into the 19th century, so say from the 1870s-ish onwards, those historians have consistently noted the political flexibility, the elastic nature of ecological politics, and a whole lot of early environmental movements, by no means all of them, but a whole lot of early environmental movements from the mid to late 19th century onwards have been affiliated, if anything, if they've had any discernible political profile, they have often been affiliated with the right. Not always the far right necessarily, but there is a lengthy history of nationalist forms of environmental politics, of racist forms of environmental politics, of environmentalists allying themselves with eugenics and anti-immigration politics, and so on and so forth. So if we have that longer historical timeline in mind, then it should not be so surprising to find that today, in the 21st century, right-wing versions of ecology seem to be popping up all over the place.
Yeah, that it makes me think of Teddy Roosevelt. I think that was one of my first revelations was reading Teddy Roosevelt and his actual words, and having lived in New York City and gone to the Museum of Natural History, which had that sort of appalling statue in front of it that just got taken out. But either way, I remember reading about reading Teddy Roosevelt's words and how he associated conservation of the environment with kind of preserving a certain form of masculinity and certain historical forms of manhood and etc. And I'm like thinking, wow, I'm hearing like the fatherland, I'm hearing homeland, I'm hearing, I'm connecting like the land itself to this ideology there. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt is a terrific example. One of his friends and colleagues who back then was an even better known conservationist figure, a guy named Madison Grant. Grant was not as famous politically because he didn't become president, but he was a very, very prominent person in the late 19th, early 20th century environmental circles in the United States. And Madison Grant was just as famous as a supporter of eugenics as he was as a supporter of environmentalism. So unfortunately, there are many, many examples of that we could trace. In other words, you don't just have to look to examples like Nazi Germany, even though that's what I study as a historian. You don't just have to look to examples like Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. If for those of your listeners who are in North America, you could look at the history of North American forms of environmentalism going all the way back to the latter half of the 19th century to find examples of these authoritarian right-wing environmentalist outlooks.
Is this related to, how would we relate this to like ideas of social Darwinism? Because it seems like it's connected to like this idea of like the state of nature. And I'm hearing it a lot now through the years of COVID, the kind of like,
yes,
right? Like, we can get into that, but it seems like social Darwinism seems like an idea that's connected to, right-wing ideas of nature and what nature is. Yeah.
That's a definite historical connection. In some of my work, I emphasize that connection, but I also think it's complicated in various ways. One of the ways is that not everybody agrees on what we even mean by social Darwinism.
Right.
If you ask scholars of Darwin, people who studied the development of Darwin's thought, a lot of those folks would say Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist, and that it was others in his same era who sort of appropriated some of his ideas, left the other ideas out that they didn't want, and then developed this wacky worldview out of it. And there's some truth to that.
It feels like survival of the fittest is what was extracted out of that.
Yeah, which is fair. You can find those if you're picky and choosy with Darwin's work. You can pick out that element in his work because it's a real element. It's definitely there in his work. But Darwin's own thinking, to my mind, was much more complex, and you could just as easily distill a much more progressive version of evolutionary thought as generations of left activists have in fact done. There's a whole history of socialist appropriations of Darwin over the years. So that's just as strong a tendency. But if we're going to stick to the right-wing versions of what is now sometimes called social Darwinist thought, there's very clear connections to things like Madison Grant and some of the other early, let's say early 20th century forms of North American conservationist and environmentalist thought. The connection that I think is in some ways even stronger is the long-standing link to anti-immigrant forms of politics, whether it's more diffuse, whether it appears more as a kind of vague hostility toward immigrants, or whether it takes a very specific judicial or political form where early conservationists were trying to pass laws to keep immigrants out, to close the borders, you might think that that is a phenomenon that arose in the 1990s or the aughts, but it's not. It's been here since. There are examples as early as the 1860s and the 1870s of early environmental thinkers arguing, even back then, we have to close the borders. We have to keep out the damaging impacts of immigrants because they are harming, quote, our natural environment.
You know, we had a discussion on the show. I think it was like 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. It's hard to tell anymore the where time is. But with there was a mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, in a grocery store in which the shooter had like a lot of online sort of material that was connected to what might be called eco-fascism. And I think that Americans heard that a little bit for a second. They heard these ideas that of people that are like sort of saying that he seemed to acknowledge the reality of climate change, and that that the response to that would be a sort of hyper-national movement that would close the borders, etc. And that to me alerted me more than ever before to like the kind of, I don't know, the sort of amalgamation of all these things coming together in really weird ways, including the mass shooting, right? Including the political violence.
Absolutely. That shooting was in 2019, the one in El Paso. Yeah. And it was, believe it or not, it was one of two mass shootings that year committed by what we might call far-right environmental perpetrators. That's not exactly the term that either of those two men, they were both men, either of those two men would use, but it's a fairly accurate description. Both the perpetrator in El Paso and the other mass shooting in 2019 was the one in Christchurch, New Zealand. The El Paso perpetrator targeted people he took to be Latino and Latina. Whether or not they were is a different question, but that was his goal. Whereas the perpetrator in Christchurch a few months earlier targeted mosques. He attacked two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. So his target, in one case Muslims, in the other case vaguely defined brown people from south of the border. Keep in mind, El Paso is right on the border. El Paso, Texas is the sister city of Juarez, Mexico. It's the same city divided by an international border. So in both of those cases, two mass shootings in the same year within a few months of each other. And in both cases, the perpetrators posted these somewhat indecipherable online manifestos. And for people who take the time to read those manifestos, which for what it's worth, I'm not even necessarily recommending because they're crazy far-right nonsense. But if you take the time to try to parse through them, they are chock full of ecological arguments, or what far-rightists take to be ecological arguments about closing the borders, about how immigrants are destroying our nature, and so on and so forth. And if you pay attention to that reasoning in their bizarre, twisted, distorted mindset, it seems to justify those forms of mass violence. Yeah. So they have come up with what they view as an ecological legitimation for mass murder of people that they think are somehow invaders and in the wrong place. And that is an unfortunately common element in a lot of far-right worldviews, even those that don't take that fatal step toward active violence.
God, that's so insane. I mean, it makes me think. I mean, I'm sitting here, looking at the Supreme Court justice being asked questions by Republicans, and there's so many that questions, like from people like Ted Cruz, are bringing up pedophiles. Like, have you punished the pedophiles enough? And that, I mean, that's just like red meat for QAnon and all this like conspiracy shit. But it connects to me, in other words, with what you're saying about these sort of like scapegoating of these groups to like absolute evil, right? Whether it be immigrants, whether it be these sort of like, I mean, for them, they're connecting the word pedophile to the Democratic Party, to liberals, to professors, teachers, whatever. Like it seems like it's like this term that allows them to be like, well, pedophiles deserve death. Like it's a really, I mean, there are a lot of ominous things happening in America, and they have been for my whole life, I think. But it feels like your work has been tracking this for a while. I wonder, it's funny you say that your eco-fascism book in 1995 comes out, just as the Unabomber story is breaking. What were the things you were seeing and looking at? In other words, where was this coming from before the Unabomber was a big story?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in both my case and in Janet's case, Janet and I knew each other through a group called the Left Green Network. We had both been founding members of this really important, but not all that successful, if I can say it that way, political organization.
That describes every left project. Really important, but not that successful.
Yeah, sadly, that is true. So this group that we worked on in the late 80s and early 90s, that's how Janet and I basically got to know each other. We lived in different states. I was in Wisconsin then, as I am now. She was in Vermont then, as she is now. So we had to, and this is all before, I guess technically the internet existed back then. It was before any of us knew how to use the internet. So we did very slow processes of sending drafts to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And what we sort of figured out is that both of us, both Janet and I, had been paying particularly close attention to developments on the German right. We both spent some time in Germany. We both read German. I, in particular, had spent, I got to think now, 1991 to 1992, I lived in Germany, one of the several times in my adult life where I've lived in Germany for a year or for extended periods, came during that streak. And a lot of my German comrades, a lot of the radical ecologists that I worked with in Germany, I was involved in a group called the Ecologische Linke, which means ecological left, another group that should have been more important historically than it was. And a lot of those folks, they had been doing this work for some time. These were radical leftists taking ecological politics seriously, but also keeping tabs on what is the far right, in this case, the far right in Germany, what are they saying about environmental issues? So I learned an enormous amount from folks in that group, the ecological left. Then I came back to the US and got back involved in my various organizations and currents and a lot of the environmental work I was doing back then. And what I quickly began to realize was a whole lot of folks in North American contexts, I would hear them repeating lines or ideas or assumptions that I knew perfectly well were a standard part of far-right German environmental discourse. But these folks saying those things in a North American context had no idea. They just had no clue that they were sounding like Nazis, because they did not mean to sound like Nazis. They thought they were giving a left-wing spin to those notions. And Janet had a similar experience through her own work in Vermont and elsewhere. And we sort of both realized this is something that people who read English need to know a whole lot more about. And that was the genesis of that book that came out in 1995.
Wow. So you're like saying, hold on, guys, you're unintentionally mouthing.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of that going on right now.
Sure.
People, I see far left people on social media saying things that I'm like, that's exactly Tucker Carlson type shit.
Yeah.
And I feel like Tucker Carlson is exactly that figure that's sort of like trying to, I don't know, trying to combine the far left and the far right in terms of their political ideologies, if that makes sense. It's pretty terrifying to watch that come together.
It is. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think everybody who's been involved in left context over the years has probably found themselves in that position. You unknowingly say something that you think has this spin, and then you only realize later, because you learn from other people who knew more about it or had been exposed to it earlier than you were, and actually had this whole other spin that you were entirely unaware of. I have done that countless times. I'm embarrassed to say how many times I've done that myself in my political life and in my personal life. It's unfortunately normal. It's a human thing. We all make mistakes like that. So what Janet and I were trying to do with that book was not sort of wag our fingers and say, get with the program, the rest of you leftists.
You're using Nazi language. Don't you know that?
Exactly. We were trying, I don't know if we succeeded, but we were trying to do something different and basically say, hey, folks, can we talk about this? Because it's really, really serious. Here's some of the historical background. My chapter in the book was largely historical. Here's some of the more contemporary background. Janet basically looked at post-1945 examples, in both cases taken largely from Germany. And then we tried to show English-speaking radicals why that history could matter to the kinds of challenges that we were facing back then, circa the mid-1990s. And if anything, I think those challenges have become even more acute, even more significant in the whatever it's been now, 27 years since.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your book Ecology Contested is out now, and
Right.
and is still concerned with these things, because to me it's like the 95 book was tapping into something that was going to become more operative in the future. I wonder. I know people are probably wondering, like, how were the Nazis environmentalists? I know that's a big question, but maybe you can give an example of, like, because I think a lot of people will be like, what the fuck are you talking about when they hear that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're right. When they have that reaction, they're onto something, because it's not the case that the Nazis were environmentalists.
Okay.
That's one of the problems. Historians who study the Nazis have a big challenge when we pivot from just talking with our disciplinary colleagues, like talking with other historians who study Nazi Germany. When we then pivot to talking to the general public, we need to remind ourselves of a bunch of different assumptions. And one of the biggest assumptions that I find non-specialists, non-historians bring to this is that they have a kind of a monolithic conception of what Nazism was. When I teach a course on Nazi Germany almost every other semester at this point. It's one of the, along with my environmental history class, it's one of the two most popular classes I teach.
God, that sounds great.
Tells you something.
Yeah. Really?
Something right there. But when I teach my course on Nazi Germany, very, very much an introductory level course, I teach at Marquette University here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I live. It's a 3,000 level course. So it's not, you don't have to be a graduate student or anything like that. So a lot of people show up for that course because they're curious. They know, they have a vague idea in their mind what Nazis are and what Nazis were, but they want to learn more. And what I have figured out over the years of teaching this over and over again is that a whole lot of students come into that class with an assumption in the back of their minds that Nazi Germany was this monolithic totalitarian state where some guy, Hitler, decided things at the top and everybody else marched in lockstep behind him, and just everyone did the same thing. That could not be further from the historical truth. For better or for worse, Nazi Germany was a chaotic, disorganized dictatorship. If you can imagine something like a chaotic, disorganized dictatorship, that's how Nazi Germany actually functioned internally. Hitler often didn't even bother to stake out a particular position. Hitler had it was almost like he was more cunning than that, or you could just say he was more lazy than that. Half the time Hitler would say, you all fight it out. He'd tell his various lieutenants, Himmler and Goebbels and Goering and whoever else, you guys fight it out. Whichever one of you gets the upper hand on some particular contested issue of policy, whoever wins that fight, I'll back that guy. But until that happens, Hitler, I'm going to stand aside and let you all work that stuff out. That happened constantly in Nazi Germany. So when it comes to environmental policy, it is only some Nazis, and I would say actually a relatively small subset of powerful Nazis, only some of them were active supporters of what we would now call ecological or environmental measures. But it wasn't marginal. Even though it was a minority strand, but my argument would be that doesn't mean we can just ignore it, because it ended up having a number of important implications for how Nazi Germany developed internally up until 1939, when they start World War II and start invading their neighboring countries. And then it affected what Nazi occupation policy was like in the parts of Europe that they conquered and ruled over for several years in a row. So that's what my research tries to trace, is who were the greener or greenish factions plural, there wasn't just one, who were the greener or greenish factions within the Nazis? What did they believe? What did they actually do? Which of their ideas were they able to implement and not just remained pipe dreams? And then also, what were some of their ideological predecessors? Where did they draw some of their ideas and inspiration from?
What an amazing story. I mean, it makes me think about like the left, sort of. It was a joke, but I think it's real. It wasn't successful, but it was important. And it seems like you see that on the right as well, right? I feel like historians, that's the job of the historian often, is to sort of locate the things that you might not know about, but actually are within the DNA of the current political landscape.
That's precisely right.
I wonder where do all these people, where does industrialization and capitalism fit into all of this? Because as I mentioned at the beginning, I when I heard the Unabomber stuff, it fit it fit in my high school brain. It fit with hippies, and hippies who were saying that cars were bad, and that factories were bad, and I sort of had this idea that we had to go back, a sort of a. I guess there was like the anarcho-primitivist, side of me that sort of again associated that stuff with the left. But I wonder. When I think about the right, I often think of capitalism, and I often think of industrialization and those sorts of things. But what is the attitude on the right about those things, if there is? I mean, I know it's complicated, but
that makes historical sense for folks, especially for folks on the left. For those of us who are opposed to capitalism in principle, as I am, especially for those of us who are opposed both to capitalism and to the nation state. I mentioned before that I'm an anarchist, so I'm not just an anti-capitalist. I'm also an anti-statist, which is an interesting, weird outlook to have on things. But for those of us who come from that set of currents within the broader radical left, it makes perfect sense that we would associate pro-capitalist stances and pro-industrialist stances with the right, because most of the right, for most of the last century at the very least, have in fact taken pro-capitalist and pro-industrialist stances. The thing is, the right is just as complicated and messy and convoluted and heterogeneous as the left is. Anyone who spent any time in left spaces knows how good we are at arguing against each other because we disagree on 1,000 different things. The exact same thing is true on the right. The right is by no means uniform. The right is itself riven with internal disagreements and debates. And there are factions on the right. Again, they are generally minority factions. But it's interesting, the further right you go, the more easily you can find these minority factions on the right who are opposed to capitalism as they conceive it, and in some cases who are opposed to industrialism as they conceive it. And the greenish wings or the greenish factions of the Nazis that I study are good examples of that trend. The folks that I study in Nazi Germany typically denounced capitalism for an interesting set of reasons. They denounced capitalism because they thought it was a Jewish invention, or at the very least, they thought it was one of them called capitalism the breeding ground of Jewry, because he thought that once capitalism was established, it let Jews have free reign for their supposed inclination to seek profit and exploit other peoples, et cetera, et cetera. So in that bizarre anti-Semitic worldview, capitalism fits in perfectly as one of their bogeymen. So these were this particular chunk of agrarian Nazis was openly anti-capitalist, and at the same time, it was bitterly and aggressively anti-Bolshevik. In fact, they sometimes said that Bolshevism, as they tended to call it, they didn't often use the term communism, they tended to use the term Bolshevism. They sometimes said Bolshevism and capitalism are just two sides of the same Jewish coin. Yeah. And we're opposed to both because both of them are exploiters of the German peasantry. They are preventing Germany from returning to its rightful natural legacy of tending for the land and taking care of the earth, et cetera, et cetera. So in that particular version of a far-right environmentalist mindset, capitalism was a clear enemy. It was something that they could denounce just as avidly, just as acutely as left-wing critics of capitalism do today. The difference, as always, is in the substance. What is it about capitalism that those two different groups were attacking or critiquing?
That's a great way to think about it. Sort of, okay, you hate capitalism, but why? Why? What is it about capitalism that you hate? Is it just because it's controlled by people you don't like? Or is it because, to me, the reason the left hates capitalism is because it creates an unequal world and it creates injustice and oppression. And I connected capitalism to ecology as well. I mean, that part of it was what's important. It's so crazy to me to think that stuff can be harnessed, by this other side. I'm glad you brought up anti-Semitism because I saw another program you were on when you were talking about anti-Semitism as this sort of like wide, sort of big basket. And I wonder how you see what's been going on in the United States in the last several, including like stuff like Pizzagate and QAnon. It's hard not to see that similar, even if it's not like literal outspoken hatred of Jews, it
Mhm.
feels like you can kind of see that circle enlarging. That's what actually is scary about it to me.
In fact, I would say it's increasingly infrequent. I might be wrong about this. Maybe this is maybe my perception is off here. So you or your listeners might correct this. But my perception lately has been it's sometimes increasingly unlikely to hear open expressions of genuine hatred for Jews. What we are increasingly likely to hear are ever so slightly coded reference, where sometimes you either barely mention Jews or you mention an individual or two who you think is Jewish, whether they actually are is a whole different question. And that can serve as sort of a stand-in for, quote, the Jews. But the examples you mentioned, QAnon and Pizzagate, those are examples of the confluence between anti-Semitism on one hand and conspiracism on the other hand.
Yep.
And that's exactly the confluence that I study. There are other versions of anti-Semitism that I know about through my historical research, but I'm not an expert on that are not part of my own research. But this is the part that I really do pay very close attention to, where anti-Semitic beliefs and conspiracist worldviews tend to come together, and unfortunately they mutually reinforce one another. And the unsettling thing about that, from my point of view, is that both conspiracism and anti-Semitism, historically speaking, if you go back 130 years or so, both of those phenomena have historically served as a place where left and right currents can meet, can encounter one another, and sometimes can start to mix together. Some scholars refer to that as left-right crossover, and it's also part of what I study historically. And even though my focus is always on the past, because that's an unfortunate aspect of what I do, I'm so focused on the past that I sometimes miss what's going on right around me right now in 2022. But even I have been able to notice it. You can't miss that those forms of left-right crossover in the last, say, 5, 6, 7 years, some of which, not all of which, draw on conspiracist assumptions and or implicit or explicit anti-Semitic assumptions. And unfortunately, that is a historically recognizable trend. It is not something that just popped up in the last few years.
No, I mean, the conspiracy stuff seems so important. I'm glad you brought that up, because that does seem like the glue between between left and right, like on Tucker Carlson, for instance. And I'm thinking now about, I mean, I've been drawn to conspiracy theories throughout my life, I would say, in part because
all
I'm
of us
like,
have.
yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm like, capitalism is a conspiracy theory, you know, like that to me is enough. And you know, I remember not only the 9/11 conspiracy theories and those spinning off into a lot of different directions, but even like for a long time, and just to think about environmentalism, like climate change, like the right's attitude towards climate change for a long time was that it's not real, that it's made up, that this is stuff that Al Gore and George Soros and a bunch of probably Jewish type people in a room somewhere made up in order to control the population. But it doesn't seem like, I don't know if that conspiracy is still there. It feels like the reality of climate change is something that's clear to everyone, and maybe the right is going to adjust itself to that. I don't know.
I think that's happening more and more. I wouldn't say that has entirely taken place already, but as I read things, the trends on the right are currently moving in that direction. If you had asked me that question, say, 2012 or so, like 10 years ago now, I would have said the vast majority of the right, at least in the English-speaking world, is still stuck in pure climate change denial, whether or not they give a conspiracist explanation for why everyone else thinks climate change is real. Very large chunks of the right, I would say the vast majority of the right back then, they just flat out denied that climate change was happening, or that if they grudgingly conceded it might sort of kind of be happening, it's certainly not caused by any human activities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That has now shifted fundamentally. And what I see today, not just in the United States, but in Germany and other parts of Europe, I see a sort of ongoing and very intense internal struggle within the right, within the mainstream right, within the far right, over how do we respond to this? Can we any longer get away with flat out denial of climate change, since it's become so utterly obvious to every living person on the planet. If we are going to agree that it happens, how do we then, as rightists, stake out a different explanation, a different diagnosis, and a different set of proposals for how to encounter it, critique it, counter it, etc.
Right. God. The conspiracy angle of it seems so important. I mean, I feel like the growth of conspiracy thinking on both the left and right, and maybe further into the mainstream as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it seems like. All of this stuff was really fun to me, like in a previous era. Like I used to encounter this sort of thinking when I would go to a head shop and find a copy of High Times. And I mean, honestly, High Times used to be filled with like 9/11 conspiracy stuff. And I thought this is just a fun way to go down the rabbit hole. And now I'm like, well, this is entering into the mainstream in really dangerous ways. And I don't think I've thought more about the danger of it than in my life than during these last 2 years with COVID. Yeah. Because it seems like it really hobbled our response, honestly, to have both the left and the right. I mean, maybe we could talk about vaccines, because there's
great question.
Before COVID happened, I had a lot of anti-vaccine people around, friends within, like anarchist and left-wing people, all left people, all Occupy Wall Street type people, honestly. Mm-hmm. Now it's like, I think anti-vaxxer and I think Trump person and right-wing and fascist, but there's another point of confluence for sure, and it seems like it's connected to that nature idea.
I think you're absolutely right. To my mind, that's an extremely recent development. That's just the last 2 years. Although, for what it's worth, you mentioned High Times. There have all along been at least some clear-sighted voices on the left who have offered really thoughtful and informed critiques of conspiracy thinking, sometimes in the same venues, in this case, High Times, that are also promoting and recycling those theories. Bill Weinberg is my favorite example of that. I don't know if you know his work. He's a lefty journalist and activist and that kind of thing in New York City. And I think I'm not sure he had a column, but for a while he wrote, among many other outlets, for High Times, if I'm remembering correctly. And Bill has been superb. I disagree with him about 1,000 other things, but he has been just so on target for decades now, saying conspiracy theories are not our friends here on the left. They are our enemies. They are obstacles to a radical critique of society. They look like they are. The conspiracy theories present themselves as if they were a radical critique of society, but critics like Weinberg and myself and others say that is not the case. That's a sort of an illusion. And we have to be able to see through that illusion, see through the ways that conspiracy theories, in fact, offer false remedies to very real problems. Until we can see through that, we're not going to be able to make sense of the social reality around us. And until the pandemic hit, I still had to work really hard, like you, with various friends of mine. I had to work really hard to try to get a lot of the people that I knew to take some of those notions seriously. And with the crazy developments over the last 2 years, I think some of that has now happened on its own, where people who might have been sitting on the fence circa 2018, or even leaning in a anti-vax or vaccine skeptical direction, if they've been paying any attention to the public health situation over the last 2 years, they have figured out on their own, oh my gosh, I guess I need to reconsider some of those stances. So we're now at the point where a lot of that openly anti-vax and openly conspiracist stuff seems to be associated primarily with, as you put it, the Trumpian right. It's still not true. There's still a whole lot of people on the left who are still bound up in that, but I think it's getting more clear-cut politically, or at least I hope it is.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, it seems like the 60s are important in this whole story, in part because I'm just thinking about, like, hearing you speak just now, and hearing about how people on both sides, on the far right and the far left, are going to be skeptical about vaccines. It seems like the world that like the Nixon years, et cetera, delivered us into this. I don't know. People talk a lot about, historical, like a moment of consensus in America, and I don't really buy that. But at the same time, it feels like there was at least some sort of consensus about reality.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it feels like, I don't know. It's weird because I almost sound like the Unabomber if I'm talking about, like, the internet, right? And I'm like, well, the internet has come along. And we've just used it in really awful ways. And capitalism has had a lot to do with that, but also it's unleashed a sort of an ability for groups like you're talking about to really get a foothold in the mainstream that they hadn't before. And that part of me, I don't know what to do about, because I'm, I believe in free speech, and I'm someone who really wants to, create a utopia on Earth, and I don't know how you do that by shutting off things.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think that you lived through this too, right? That there was a lot of utopianism associated with the internet that just seems like people don't associate with it anymore.
Sure. In the early days, that's how I've never been much of a tech person to begin with. I think when you first contacted me, I think the first thing I said was, I'm not much of a podcast guy. Sadly, true. I'm so old fashioned in that way. It's a wonder I can even use a computer semi-competently these days. So I was never on that particular bandwagon, but I sure knew people who were, say, 30-ish years ago now. And in some ways, I tried back then, I tried to be open to that possibility, even though it never spoke to me personally, because I just don't have any interest in those sorts of technological phenomena. That's one of the reasons I'm a historian. I'm so stuck in the past.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. But I tried to sort of keep an open mind and think to myself, okay, this is what happens when a technological innovation comes along. Historically, it can end up sooner or later having pretty profound impacts on how people perceive the world, how we communicate with each other. The classic example that historians love to use is the invention of the printing press, or actually we should say the inventions. Several different cultures at different periods invented versions of printing presses. But when those things catch on in a society and then start to spread, it can have this fantastic snowball effect. And sometimes it can take decades or even centuries to trace out what its eventual impacts are going to be. And in a weird sense, all of us alive right now are, weirdly, this sounds strange to say, but we're too young to be able to know how that's going to work out. It's going to be for those who have children, our children or grandchildren, if they still have a world left and we don't destroy the damn thing, they're the ones who are going to actually be able to look back and say, oh, those techno-utopians circa the 1990s, here's what they thought they were going to get. Here's what actually happened, thanks to Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and everybody else. Here's what has then happened since in what is for you and me the future. Here's the enormously important thing that happened in 2037 that we currently have no idea what it might be. Those are things that just take their time to sort themselves through. So I am still now, even today, I am trying to at least be open to the possibility that some versions of the internet or some parts of the internet could be harnessed for emancipatory social goals, where we could make them more liberatory, more participatory, where they engage more and more people in increasingly democratic forums. I am open to that possibility, but it seems really far away given the current architecture and the current ownership structure, the fact that we still live under capitalism, that we still live under forms of the modern nation state. All of those things are immense obstacles to doing anything liberatory and anything emancipatory with a technology that, at least for now, seems to have been captured by for-profit private sources.
Yeah, not only that, though, you're right. It's like the big, the Zuckerbergs and the Bezos, et cetera, have shaped this, and they're profiting off of it. And they seem like they, not only did they profit off it, but I mean, we did a show about like Peter Thiel coming to Facebook and, let's rig the algorithm so that we get more right-wing news here and that sort of thing. That's absolutely fascinating and horrifying that they can do stuff like that. And I love your historian's view that's like, we can't know. We can't, but at the same time, we're like in history and people are going to make judgments about what things mean. That's what's so frustrating. I mean, you remember when like the Arab Spring happened and it was like on the cover of Time magazine was like, Twitter is democracy now, and it was just kind of like, oh, okay. It was that easy. We just had to just invent a phone app and that ended our centuries long quest for equality and freedom on Earth. I don't know. Part of me, I wonder what you think about this, because the pessimistic part of me sees stuff like, I don't know, January 6th, et cetera. And it's kind of like, well, why the right seems like the energy is heading in that direction. And I know that, and it just seems like the left is just not as effective for whatever reason. It seems, in other words, my analogy is always that like the left is like pushing something uphill and the right rolls downhill, and we roll down the hill to fascism. And it feels, and I know January 6th is another one of those things where we're kind of like, we could say in 30 years, well, it actually wasn't that important. Or we could say in 30 years, well, that was the beginning of something really, really terrifying in America.
Precisely.
Right?
Yeah. That is a very real possibility. It's weird for someone like me. It's weird to be living through this historical moment, because for years and years and years and years on end, I've been the guy saying, yeah, but what about the far right? What about the radical right? What about this and that? And for a very, very, very long time, my colleagues, my comrades, my family members, my friends, they could plausibly respond, oh, come on, Peter, that's just you, because that's what you're obsessed with. That's what you study. That's what you've been writing about since the early 1990s. So, of course, you think that's a really big deal. And the thing is, back then, they were kind of right. It was my weird little thing. Me and a few other people around the world were really trying to pay attention to that. And oh, do I wish they were still right. I wish I was wrong. I wish the 1995 version of Peter Staudenmaier or the 2010 version of Peter Staudenmaier had been wrong.
Yeah.
And it's depressing and crushing that these weird, seemingly formerly obscure forces that I've been trying to pay attention to for decades now, that they have moved closer and closer and closer and closer to the political mainstream, not just in the United States, in a whole lot of other countries around the world, where far-right and authoritarian alternatives now look reasonable.
Yeah. Yes.
Now look like, yes, we can vote for that. Or if we lose the vote, we can storm the Capitol or the Bundestag or whatever and get our way. It is reminding me, even though historians are generally pretty cautious with comparisons like this, it's reminding me more and more of roughly 100 years ago in large parts of Western Europe. You and I think of today's U.S. as being unprecedentedly polarized. And again, that's true if your historical reference point is the post-1945, post-war United States. But if you go back to the 1930s and the 1920s, you'll find a time historically where capitalism was one possibility, parliamentary democracy was one possibility, Stalinism was one possibility, fascism was one very, very possible possibility. That was polarization. That wasn't two-way polarization. That was like seven-way polarization without any actual majority almost anywhere. And it's not that I'm saying we've returned to Weimar Germany. It's more that a number of the trends that people who study things in the 1920s and 1930s are so used to recognizing, we're seeing more and more variations on similar dynamics appearing now in the 2020s, including in places like the United States, where I have to say I had not really anticipated something like that necessarily happening here in such a short period of time.
Yeah. God, so well said, Peter. This was really great, and really thanks for scaring the shit out of me. It makes me think of Joe Rogan as another figure, honestly, that maybe unintentionally or maybe not so, but he like launders a lot of this shit. And it's kind of it's amazing because you say Weimar Germany, and I know that's like an association people make that's just can be very easy and flatten and distort. Yeah. Yep. But at the same time, I hear like when I turn on Joe Rogan clip and see him like really quickly just saying something like someone wears it was Bill Burr. It was another comedian who says, I wear a mask, whenever the sign says to wear a mask. And Joe Rogan said, yeah, but you look like a little bitch in that mask. And I thought, there's your sort of like gender politics, the sort of masculinity, the sort of idea of like, you got to be strong enough to resist the virus on your own. And if you're not, you're a little bitch. And like, to me, they're like the language of like, 90s culture, 2000s culture, MTV culture is there. It's not a guy, screaming on a podium like Father Coughlin. It's something more like, man, you look like a little bitch in that mask, and everyone laughs, ha ha ha. And you're kind of like, wait, this is how it gets in the door, though. Like that's what's scary about it to me. It's like calling Joe Rogan a fascist seems sort of absurd to someone that listens to him, because you're just like, oh, they just sound like a bunch of guys shooting the shit. And I'm like, yeah, but that's exactly the danger to me.
Yeah, Rogan's a good example. He's got a real gift for absorbing the whatever is the nature of current cultural preoccupations. He spins them in that highly masculinist direction. And I don't know enough to know whether that's just him, that's his actual persona, or if that is his performative persona that he puts on for purposes of doing his show. But it kind of doesn't matter because the cultural impacts are unfortunately the same in either case. So he's not a fascist. He's kind of not anything. It's the thing. He's more like a sponge.
Yeah.
Who's really perceptive and responsive to the swirling currents in the culture around us. And because he does not have a critical filter of his own, he's not able to catch, or at least in his public version, he's not able to catch the bullshit that comes through a lot of those cultural currents. So instead, he just recycles them and spins them out further, and thus sends them on along to millions of more people. That is a big problem. Until the rest of us, until folks who identify as leftists or progressives or radicals or whatever we want to call ourselves, until the rest of us figure out how to learn that same talent of talking to regular people, which many of us are extraordinarily bad at, until we learn how to get some of our counter message, some of our alternative critiques circulating in the broader culture, we're going to be stuck with situations where someone like Joe Rogan, consciously or otherwise, good-natured or not, ends up perpetrating a series of disastrously wrong-headed beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and putting them into an algorithm that's just kind of spit out instantly to millions and millions of people and amplified, and that's part of it too. Is like, watching the track of, like, I don't know if you watch like Dr. Strangelove. There's like a John, there's like a John Birch Society general that's talking about fluoride in the water and all this kind of shit, and it was like, okay, he's some psycho. He is in the State Department or he's in the military, so that's scary. But it always seemed like, Kubrick in that movie was sort of, making reference to the fact that there are these kind of cultural streams around.
Absolutely.
But it's much more. I feel like the John Birch Society, like, somehow is like the winner in some weird way of that long arc, because I hear that stuff coming out of everyone's mouths now.
Yeah.
This was great. Peter Staudenmaier, thank you so much for joining me. I want to say the name of your book again, and your work spans decades, and you have a lot of cool stuff. But your book is called Ecology Contested: Environmental Politics Between Left and Right, and I think it's a great primer on all the stuff we just talked about. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Peter Staudenmaier, for a fantastic conversation that I haven't stopped thinking about since. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. You can find more Nostalgia Trap material at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. We just put up an episode with Ryan Boyd last week about Steely Dan and listening to vinyl records. Got a lot of feedback on that episode. I think it struck a chord, in part because we were talking about how technology and the internet has just completely destroyed our ability to read or have any attention span or communicate effectively, etc. That was a really intense conversation. Again, lots of people had things to say about that. So if you want to join that discussion, patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. And thanks, Ryan Boyd, for coming on the program again. Really fun talking with him always. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.